The Invictus Games has suffered its greatest blow yet, and that is a decision by Australia to remove all funding from their team.
Australia's decision to slash Invictus funding may have triggered the biggest crisis Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have faced since leaving the royal family. What was once Harry's respected project is suddenly surrounded by questions over money, influence, and whether governments believe in the Sussex brand. Critics say the couple turned Invictus into a machine, while supporters insist the backlash is unfair and politically motivated. But as sponsors reportedly hesitate and pressure grows behind walls, one question now dominates everything: is Invictus collapse? Now, is Australia exposing a growing problem? Or is Prince Harry's hidden agenda finally being brought into the open? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Australia sends Harry dangerous message. The announcement did not arrive with a dramatic press conference or a televised confrontation. Instead, the Australian government quietly removed federal funding connected to Invictus support programs, and within hours, the decision was spreading across international headlines. For Prince Harry, the silence surrounding the move appeared almost as damaging as the cut itself. Invictus had long been presented as his most respected achievement outside the royal family, a project built around wounded veterans, recovery, and purpose. But suddenly, one of the countries most publicly connected to the Games seemed to be stepping away. What made the moment especially uncomfortable was the timing. Only weeks earlier, Harry and Meghan had been linked to high-profile appearances and growing media attention connected to Australia and the wider Commonwealth conversation surrounding Invictus. Supporters believed those appearances were meant to reinforce the couple's global relevance and strengthen public confidence in the organization. Instead, critics quickly interpreted the funding decision as a warning sign that governments were beginning to look at Invictus differently. Australian officials insisted the decision was part of broader budget priorities and pointed toward other veteran support initiatives receiving billions in funding. Publicly, there was no direct attack on Harry, Meghan, or the Games themselves. Yet commentators immediately noticed the symbolism behind the move. Invictus was not just another charity event attached to a celebrity figure. It was deeply tied to Harry's personal identity and public image. Every setback surrounding the organization now carried consequences far beyond finances alone. As debate intensified online, questions started spreading about whether Invictus still justified major taxpayer investment. Critics argued that costs connected to recent games had grown too large, while ordinary veterans continued facing financial and mental health struggles at home. Supporters pushed back, insisting the games still provided emotional recovery and international visibility for injured servicemen and women. But the argument itself revealed a deeper problem. Invictus was no longer being discussed purely as an inspiring mission. It was becoming part of a larger political and cultural fight. Behind the scenes, royal commentators claimed Harry had been blindsided by how quickly support appeared to weaken. For years, Invictus survived criticism because many people viewed it as one of the few projects genuinely connected to service rather than celebrity. Now, that protection seemed less certain. Australia's withdrawal created an atmosphere of doubt that extended far beyond one government decision. If a major Commonwealth nation could quietly step back without major backlash, others might eventually feel comfortable doing the same. For Harry, the danger was no longer limited to funding losses alone. The bigger threat was perception. Invictus had always represented stability during years of royal conflict and public controversy. If confidence in that institution began collapsing, then the foundation supporting Harry's remaining public credibility could begin collapsing with it. What began as a quiet budget adjustment was now transforming into something far more serious. Harry's defining legacy project could survive mounting scrutiny, political hesitation, and the mood surrounding the Sussex brand. Then palace insiders noticed something even more alarming. Was Australia only the beginning? Were other nations preparing to quietly distance themselves from Harry's biggest legacy project? And behind closed doors, who allegedly warned that this decision could trigger a far deeper collapse nobody inside Invictus expected? Stay with us. Crisis spreads. Inside Sussex operation. Inside Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's media operation, the reaction to Australia's Invictus funding decision reportedly became immediate and deeply tense.
And have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle dragged Invictus Games down with them? Recent information about the Invictus Games Foundation.
What appeared publicly as a quiet government budget adjustment was privately viewed as something far more dangerous. The story was spreading rapidly across television, newspapers, and social media, and advisors allegedly understood the risk almost instantly. This was not simply about money disappearing from one veteran program. It threatened the image surrounding the one project still strongly connected to Harry's reputation. For years, Invictus had protected him from criticism that followed the couple after their royal departure. Suddenly, even that protection seemed unstable. Reports began circulating that members of the Sussex team entered damage control mode as international headlines intensified. Discussions reportedly focused on limiting negative coverage before the story could grow into a wider conversation about confidence in the Invictus Games themselves. Commentators noticed that public messaging from the Sussex camp remained unusually careful. There were no aggressive responses and no direct attacks against Australian officials. Instead, the silence created its own tension. Critics interpreted it as evidence that Harry's team understood how serious the situation had become. The concern extended far beyond Australia alone. According to royal observers, fears reportedly grew that other Commonwealth nations could begin reconsidering their own financial relationships and public support structures connected to Invictus. That possibility carried enormous consequences. If Australia stepped away without major political backlash, other governments might quietly feel empowered to follow. Even the suggestion of that scenario was enough to trigger anxiety around future games, sponsorships, and long-term stability. At the same time, questions reportedly started emerging about corporate partners. Invictus had relied heavily on major sponsors and public goodwill to maintain its international profile, but controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan had become increasingly polarizing in recent years. Some commentators suggested companies might now hesitate before publicly attaching themselves to the Sussex brand. No dramatic corporate exits had yet been confirmed, but the fear of silent distancing was becoming part of the conversation. For Harry personally, the pressure appeared especially emotional. Royal commentators repeatedly described Invictus as the final major institution still fully associated with his identity. Unlike interviews, streaming projects, or public appearances, Invictus carried genuine emotional credibility because of its connection to wounded veterans. Losing public trust in that space would mean far more than another bad headline. It could damage the one remaining area where even critics often gave Harry respect. Meanwhile, Meghan's public image strategy reportedly moved in a very different direction. Lifestyle posts, polished family moments, and carefully presented social media content began appearing while criticism surrounding Invictus continued building. Supporters viewed those posts as harmless attempts to maintain positivity during controversy. Critics saw something else entirely. To them, the timing looked calculated, almost as though attention was being redirected away from the growing crisis. As the backlash expanded, the atmosphere surrounding the Sussex operation no longer resembled a temporary media storm. It was beginning to look like a struggle to protect the last stable piece of Harry's public legacy altogether. Palace aides were already fighting fires behind closed doors, yet another terrifying question suddenly emerged. Were sponsors preparing silent exits? Could Commonwealth allies follow Australia's lead next? And if Invictus collapses under mounting pressure, what exactly remains of Harry's carefully protected public image after years of controversy? Let's unravel the truth. Veterans begin asking difficult questions. As the controversy surrounding Invictus continued growing, the conversation slowly began shifting in a far more uncomfortable direction. At first, most headlines focused on Australia's decision to remove funding and the pressure building around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. But soon, attention moved away from politics and toward the veterans themselves. That change altered the entire tone of the debate. Critics were no longer simply questioning financial decisions. They were beginning to question whether Invictus still truly served the wounded servicemen and women it was originally created to honor. The scrutiny intensified after reports highlighted the enormous costs attached to recent games. public discussions online focused heavily on the financial imbalance between spending and direct support for competitors. Comparisons quickly emerged with other veteran sporting events operating on dramatically smaller budgets. Commentators pointed to programs in the United States and Europe that reportedly managed to support athletes at a fraction of Invictus costs. Those comparisons became impossible to ignore because they created a deeper question hanging over the organization. Where was the money actually going? For years, Invictus had been protected by emotional goodwill. The image of wounded veterans rebuilding their confidence through sport carried undeniable power. Many people still believe deeply in that mission, but critics argued that recent games increasingly looked more like large-scale international productions than focused recovery programs.
By honoring the First Nations who are hosting this year's games, Lil'wat, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh.
Lavish venues, celebrity appearances, expensive travel, and polished media coverage started becoming part of the criticism. The concern was not simply that the games cost money, it was the growing perception that the image surrounding the event had become larger than the veterans themselves. That perception worsened as stories from competitors began circulating online. Some athletes reportedly struggled to cover travel costs, accommodation, and equipment despite the massive budgets connected to the games. Supporters of Invictus argued that organizing international events naturally involved huge logistical expenses. Others insisted those explanations no longer satisfied the public. The emotional contrast became difficult to overlook. On one side stood wounded veterans trying to participate in life-changing competitions. On the other stood headlines discussing celebrity attention, luxury arrangements, and growing financial concerns. One particular incident intensified the discomfort surrounding the organization. During competition, a wheelchair basketball player reportedly suffered a serious injury after falling from his chair. Critics claimed the athlete did not receive the level of support many expected from an organization built around veteran care. Supporters pushed back against the criticism, warning against using isolated incidents to discredit the entire mission. Yet the story continued spreading because it touched something emotional beneath the political arguments. People began asking whether Invictus had drifted too far from its original purpose. Online discussions became increasingly divided. Some defended Prince Harry passionately, arguing that Invictus still changed lives and created international awareness for wounded veterans. Others questioned whether the event had become too connected to celebrity branding and public image management. Meghan's growing visibility during recent games only intensified those arguments, especially among critics who believed media attention increasingly centered on the Sussexes rather than competitors themselves. By this point, the crisis surrounding Invictus no longer felt limited to funding cuts or political decisions. The deeper issue becoming visible was trust. People were beginning to ask whether Invictus still belonged primarily to veterans, or whether something far more complicated had quietly taken control behind the scenes. Veterans who once defended Invictus were suddenly asking dangerous questions. Where was the money truly going? Why were wounded athletes still struggling privately? And what happened behind closed doors after several insiders finally spoke out? What emerged next threatened to shake the foundation of Invictus far beyond public criticism. Corporate partners begin quiet retreat. The pressure surrounding the Invictus Games was no longer coming only from governments, critics, or online commentators. A new and potentially more dangerous problem was beginning to emerge behind closed doors. Questions were growing about whether major sponsors and corporate partners still wanted to be publicly connected to Prince Harry's flagship project at all. Unlike political criticism, corporate hesitation often arrives quietly. There are no dramatic speeches, no direct accusations, and no public confrontations. Instead, support slowly fades into silence. For Invictus, that silence was beginning to attract serious attention.
Not only at the Invictus Games, but each and every day. Your courage, your resilience, your humanity.
Rumors started circulating that several companies were quietly reducing their involvement or reconsidering future commitments connected to upcoming games. Some reports pointed toward sponsors whose agreements had allegedly expired without renewal announcements. Others noted that public enthusiasm from major brands appeared noticeably weaker compared to previous years. On the surface, nothing catastrophic had officially happened, yet analysts watching the situation closely noticed something unusual. Companies that once promoted their connection to Invictus proudly were suddenly becoming far more cautious. That caution mattered, because large international events depend heavily on private support. Government assistance alone could not sustain the scale of the Invictus Games. Sponsorships helped cover logistics, venues, travel, broadcasting, and promotion. If major brands lost confidence, the long-term stability of the organization could face genuine strain. What made the situation even more complicated was the growing belief that the controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan Markle had become difficult for businesses to navigate safely. Over the past several years, the Sussex brand had become deeply polarizing. Supporters viewed the couple as victims of relentless media pressure and institutional resistance. Critics saw constant controversy following nearly every project, interview, or appearance connected to them. For corporations focused on protecting their public image, that division created risk. Analysts increasingly suggested that some businesses no longer viewed association with Harry and Meghan as commercially predictable or safe. Whether fair or unfair, that perception appeared to be spreading. The atmosphere around Birmingham 2027 reportedly reflected those growing anxieties. Behind the scenes, preparations for the future games allegedly became more difficult as organizers searched for stable financial backing and public confidence. Commentators pointed out that excitement surrounding the event no longer seemed as automatic as it once did. Instead of conversations centered entirely on wounded veterans and inspirational recovery stories, discussions increasingly returned to controversy, spending, and public backlash connected to the Sussexes themselves. Some defenders of Invictus argued the fears were exaggerated. They insisted corporate partnerships naturally evolve over time and warned against interpreting every business decision as a rejection of Harry or the Games. Others believed the pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Australia's funding withdrawal had already weakened confidence. If sponsors also started stepping back, even gradually, the consequences could become far more serious than temporary embarrassment. For Prince Harry, the symbolism carried enormous weight. Invictus was never meant to operate like a celebrity vanity project dependent on public mood swings and corporate calculations. It was supposed to represent resilience, service, and recovery. Yet critics increasingly argued that the organization had become inseparable from the Sussex brand itself. That growing perception created a dangerous cycle. The more controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan intensified, the harder it became for Invictus to stand apart from it, and the harder it became for supporters to separate mission from image entirely. Sponsors were not issuing denials anymore. They were disappearing.
At this moment, when there is no shortage of crises, no absence of uncertainty.
Who privately warned Birmingham organizers behind closed doors? Which companies suddenly stopped returning calls? And if major backers were already pulling away, what frightening reality was quietly unfolding inside Invictus before the public ever discovered the truth? Keep watching. Meghan's pivot fuels new speculation. As criticism surrounding the Invictus Games continued intensifying, Meghan Markle's public strategy appeared to shift in a noticeably different direction. While Prince Harry faced growing scrutiny connected to funding concerns, sponsorship doubts, and questions about the future of Invictus, Meghan's online presence became increasingly focused on lifestyle branding, polished family imagery, and carefully curated personal content. To supporters, the posts looked harmless and familiar, another attempt to maintain positivity during a difficult public moment. To critics, however, the timing raised uncomfortable questions. The reaction online became immediate and deeply divided. Some defended Meghan, arguing that she had every right to continue building her personal projects regardless of the controversy surrounding Invictus. Others accused her of trying to redirect public attention away from the growing crisis surrounding Harry's most important charitable legacy. That divide exposed a larger tension already developing inside public perception of the Sussexes. Increasingly, media discussions were beginning to treat Harry and Meghan as separate forces rather than a single united brand. Much of the criticism centered on optics. As debates over veteran funding and public accountability spread across news coverage,
Harry and Meghan did confirm our story, and then we have the front page of the Decade with the headline.
Meghan's social media activity focused heavily on carefully staged moments, lifestyle themes, and emotional family presentation. Critics argued the contrast felt disconnected from the seriousness of the Invictus backlash. Supporters countered that online attacks against Meghan had become automatic and unfair, no matter what she posted or when she posted it. Yet even neutral observers noticed the growing disconnect between Harry's increasingly defensive position and Meghan's polished public visibility. That difference became more noticeable as commentators started focusing on Harry himself. During discussions surrounding Invictus, he appeared increasingly isolated. Public debate centered directly on him because the games had always been deeply tied to his identity. Invictus was not just another project attached to celebrity influence. It represented the strongest remaining link between Harry and the values of service, military support, and public duty that once shaped his royal image. Every headline questioning Invictus therefore landed personally on him in ways that Meghan's business ventures did not. At the same time, Meghan's ambitions appeared to be moving further into independent territory. Reports about media projects, branding opportunities, lifestyle content, and personal storytelling continued circulating while Harry remained trapped inside growing questions about Invictus itself. Some commentators suggested the couple's priorities were beginning to separate publicly, even if not privately. Others believed the contrast simply reflected survival strategy during a difficult media cycle. Regardless of interpretation, the perception of emotional distance between their public roles was becoming harder to ignore. Critics especially focused on the idea that Harry seemed locked in a defensive battle over legacy, while Meghan appeared focused on reinvention. That contrast created a psychological tension running beneath nearly every headline. Invictus represented Harry's past, his military identity, and the one institution still widely respected even after years of royal conflict. Meghan's branding strategy, meanwhile, pointed toward a future built around influence, lifestyle, and media independence. The deeper the controversy grew, the more those two worlds seemed to pull in opposite directions. For the first time in years, some observers began wondering whether the Sussex brand itself was starting to fracture under the pressure, not through open conflict, but through diverging priorities during one of the most difficult public crises the couple had faced together recently. Why was Meghan suddenly pushing visibility while Harry faced growing pressure alone? Were palace fears quietly becoming reality? And as public sympathy fractured in every direction, what explosive revelation was about to deepen the divide between Harry, Meghan, and the collapsing Invictus narrative even further? Stay glued. Royal contrast shifts public sympathy. As pressure continued building around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, another royal story was quietly dominating international headlines for entirely different reasons. Thousands of miles away, Catherine, Princess of Wales, arrived in Italy for a major overseas engagement that immediately generated enormous media attention. Crowds gathered in public squares, journalists competed for access, and royal commentators described the atmosphere as a reminder of an older style of monarchy built around duty, discipline, and quiet public connection. The timing could not have been more uncomfortable for the Sussexes. While Harry faced growing questions surrounding Invictus funding, sponsorship fears, and public trust, Catherine's appearances projected calm stability. Reports from Italy described packed crowds, enthusiastic receptions, and widespread excitement surrounding her return to international royal duties. More than 300 journalists reportedly applied for accreditation to cover the visit, forcing organizers to turn many away. Commentators quickly noticed the symbolism behind those scenes. At the exact moment Harry's public image seemed trapped inside controversy, Catherine's visibility was producing almost universally positive reactions. The comparison became impossible to avoid. Royal analysts repeatedly contrasted Catherine's carefully structured public role with what they described as the celebrity-driven media approach surrounding Harry and Meghan. Catherine's appearances focused heavily on charitable work, education, and direct engagement with local communities. Cameras followed her naturally because public interest already existed. Critics of the Sussexes argued the opposite dynamic increasingly surrounded Harry and Meghan, where attention itself often became the story rather than the causes attached to it. What made the contrast even more powerful was the silence from Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. There were no public attacks against Harry or Meghan, no defensive statements, and no visible attempts to deepen the controversy. Instead, the palace appeared to benefit simply by continuing normal royal operations, while public comparison happened on its own. For many observers, that silence carried strategic weight. The monarchy no longer needed direct confrontation. The difference in public reception was becoming visible without anyone openly saying it. Online discussions quickly turned toward legitimacy and credibility. Supporters of Harry argued he had spent years facing relentless criticism no matter what he did, and insisted the comparison with Catherine was unfair. Others believed the contrast highlighted a deeper issue that had followed Harry since leaving royal life.
Most people lost sympathy. They read it and saw, wow, you've had all these opportunities, you've had all these mentors.
Outside the structure of the monarchy, maintaining stable public goodwill had become increasingly difficult. Projects connected to him now seemed vulnerable to controversy in ways they once were not. For Harry personally, the situation carried emotional consequences beyond headlines alone. His separation from the royal family had originally been presented as a path toward independence and freedom. Yet moments like this seem to expose the cost of that decision more clearly than ever. Catherine's successful tour reinforced the power and stability still attached to the institution Harry left behind. At the same time, his own public standing appeared increasingly dependent on fragile projects now facing growing scrutiny. The deeper the Invictus crisis expanded, the more the story transformed into something larger than funding cuts or sponsorship concerns. It was becoming a symbolic battle over relevance itself. On one side stood a monarchy projecting continuity, order, and discipline. On the other stood Harry and Meghan navigating criticism, image fatigue, and uncertainty surrounding the future of their public influence. While the gap between those worlds seemed to widen with every passing headline internationally. Why were global audiences suddenly embracing William and Catherine, while Harry's royal standing kept collapsing behind closed palace walls? Was silence becoming the monarchy's most powerful weapon? And as tensions deepened privately, what shocking decision was already forming inside the institution that could permanently redefine Harry's future forever? Stay tuned. Harry faces defining public reckoning. By the time the controversy reached its final stage, the conversation surrounding Prince Harry had become far bigger than a single funding decision in Australia. What first appeared to be an uncomfortable political setback was now being discussed as a possible turning point for the entire future of the Invictus Games. Questions were spreading across media coverage, online debates, and royal commentary with increasing urgency. If one major supporter had already stepped away, what would happen if others followed? And if that happened, could Invictus survive the financial and reputational pressure now building around it? The uncertainties surrounding future funding created a growing sense of instability. Invictus had always depended on a combination of government support, private sponsorships, and public goodwill, but all three now appeared vulnerable. Australia's decision triggered fears that continued financial withdrawals could slowly weaken the organization from multiple directions at once. Some supporters insisted the Games remained too important to fail, and argued that wounded veterans still benefited enormously from the global attention and community support Invictus provided. Others questioned whether emotional loyalty alone would be enough to sustain such an expensive international operation moving forward. At the center of that uncertainty stood Harry himself. For years, Invictus represented the strongest part of his public identity outside the royal family. Even critics who disagreed with his interviews, memoir, or media projects often treated Invictus differently because of its direct connection to veterans and recovery. Now, however, speculation was growing about Harry's future role inside the organization.
As we embark on this year's competition, here is my challenge to all of you. Show the world how you behave.
Some commentators wondered whether he needed to step back from celebrity-focused appearances and return Invictus entirely to veterans themselves. Others argued the Games would lose international attention without his involvement altogether. The debate surrounding Meghan Markle added another complicated layer to the crisis. Critics increasingly questioned whether the Sussex media strategy had become too centered on image, branding, and publicity at the exact moment Invictus needed seriousness and stability. Supporters rejected that argument, insisting Meghan was being unfairly blamed for problems connected to funding and politics rather than her own actions. Yet the perception continued spreading that Harry's charity work and Meghan's celebrity-driven projects were moving audiences in very different emotional directions. That growing divide led to speculation about what Harry might do next. Some royal observers suggested he could attempt a major public reset focused entirely on veterans, removing distractions and rebuilding trust around the original mission of Invictus. Such a move would likely require fewer media battles, less celebrity spectacle, and a more disciplined public image. Whether Harry was willing or able to make that shift remained deeply uncertain. After years of public conflict with the monarchy, media institutions, and critics online, rebuilding broad trust would not happen quickly. The emotional weight surrounding the situation came from one undeniable reality. Invictus was not simply another project for Harry. It was arguably the last institution still connecting him to widespread public goodwill. Losing confidence in that space would carry consequences far beyond headlines or sponsorship concerns. It could permanently alter how his post-royal legacy is remembered. As pressure continued mounting from governments, critics, sponsors, and shifting public opinion, the future of Invictus suddenly seemed tied to a far more personal question. Could Harry still separate service from celebrity before the world finally decided to walk away completely forever? So, what do you think? Is Australia's funding decision exposing deeper problems inside Invictus and Harry's public image? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more royal news.